This brings us to our next topic, namely remembering. So you've listened to the lecture or you've read the study materials, you've taken good notes, and now the next question becomes, how do you ensure that you remember the key things that you've learned? There's a school of thought out there that says that memorizing or remembering is no longer important because we can take our notes with us on whatever portable device we've saved them on. We have Google at our fingertips to tell us the answer to any factual question that we could possibly have. So committing stuff to memory seems superfluous. But friends, that's at best a half-truth. The reality is that your brain can only work with material that it has ready access to. And so you need to have the raw materials of what you've learned accessible to your brain through recall in order to be able to use them at the point of need. And that requires that you do commit to memory the crucial information that you learn. The good news is that there are proven ways of remembering what you've learned, and we're going to unpack those in this lesson. By way of a quick overview, we are going to look at three things in this lesson. Firstly, we are going to look at some flawed strategies, things that you probably do intuitively, but which we know are not the optimal way to learn and to remember what you've learned. And then we're going to look at the absolute essential technique for remembering, namely spaced repetition. And then lastly, we're going to look at some mnemonic devices, not demonic devices. Mnemonic devices are tricks and tools that you can use while you're in the process of mastering information. So we're going to look at flawed strategies, then spaced repetition, and then mnemonic devices. Let's begin by considering some flawed strategies. These are wrong methods of trying to remember what you've learned. Whether it's a hammer or a piece of software, you have to use a tool correctly in order for it to work effectively. And that's as applicable to memory aids as it is to tools like hammers and pliers. You need to use them correctly. You intuitively know the things that will help you to remember what you've learned. The two key things are repetition and mnemonic devices, memory aids. You know this, but your instincts lead you astray so that you use them in the wrong manner. It's like trying to use a hammer to screw in a screw. It simply doesn't work well. So let's look at the things that you probably do instinctively, but which are suboptimal for retaining what you've learned. The first flawed strategy is massed repetition. Massed repetition. Now, what is massed repetition, you ask? And I answer that it's the thing you do most intuitively when you are trying to commit something to memory. Let's imagine that you are trying to learn a poem off by heart. What is your strategy? If you are like the vast majority of people, you might set aside an hour and read through that poem repeatedly, maybe building it up line by line, until at the end of that hour-long study session, you're able to recite the poem flawlessly. Maybe you've repeated it 50 times in that 1 hour study session. That, friends, is massed repetition. The bad news is this is a very ineffective way of memorizing critical information. It doesn't imprint anything in our long-term memory, so it doesn't work. Now, why? Why does massed repetition not work? The answer lies in the way that our brains store information. Your brain stores information in a vast network, kind of information web. And within that network of information, there are what we call information highways. And so the wider a highway, the more it's a large freeway to a piece of stored information, the easier it is for you to access and recall that information. So even if you've stored something away somewhere in the deep recesses of your brain, but the pathway leading to that information is very narrow and thin, overrun by bushes, hard for you to access, then when you need that information, you can't recall it. And the reason that massed repetition doesn't work is that it doesn't build strong information highways to the information that you're trying to put into your memory. It builds puny little pathways. Neural networks build the same way that muscles build. If you're trying to build strong biceps, I won't show you mine. They certainly won't pass any test of strong biceps. But if you're trying to build strong biceps, what do you need to do? You need to continually flex and release, flex and release. So this repeated action of activating them and then closing them is how you build strong muscles. That's exactly how our brains build strong neural networks. We need to repeatedly open and close the pathway to a piece of information. Think about a pathway in the bush. The more people that walk through it, the more times it's activated, the wider and easier to use it becomes. Our neural networks are exactly the same. So when you're studying your poem and you read it through 50 times in 1 hour, do you know what? That only counts as one activation of that neural network. However, if you were to read it 10 times a day for 5 days, that counts as 5 activations of that neural network, and it produces far superior recollection. The second method that doesn't work is what we might call delayed repetition or delayed review. The idea is very simple. You study a piece of material at a particular point in time. So this is where you first learn it. This might be the class that you attend, and so you first get exposure to this information at a point in time. The test that you need to remember it for happens much later. So this is the time that you need to be able to recall it. What most of us do is we learn it here, we make our notes, and then we put those notes away. And when do you review them? Answer, you are likely to review them here, let's say the day or the few days before the test, 90% of the way between the first time you learn the information and the time that you need to recall it, shortly before, let's say, the test or exam. And research shows that this is ineffective. The optimal time to review that material is more like 20% of the time between your first exposure and when you need to remember it. So you would be much better reviewing that work much closer to your first exposure than to the exam. Of course, this is all assuming you're only going to review it once. If you were only going to review it once, you should do it somewhere around here, not somewhere around here. But of course, this is very few people's instinct. We tend to listen, make our notes, file them away, haul them out just before the test, and start to review them. Very suboptimal strategy for best retention. Now let's talk about mnemonic devices. Do you use mnemonics to aid your memory? I absolutely bet that you do. What is a mnemonic device? It's a way of packaging content that makes it easier to remember, makes it more memorable. If you've ever used things like acronyms or rhymes to help you remember facts, then you've used mnemonics. And currently, visual mnemonics are the most powerful forms. Now, to use mnemonic devices well, you need to know which ones to use for which purposes. Which ones to use for which purposes. Although they aid recall, they provide a clue or a trigger that you have to practice. If you use the right mnemonic and you don't practice the recall trigger, after a while you will be unable to remember what the mnemonic was designed to help you remember. So mnemonic devices do work, but there are 2 secrets to them. You've got to use the right one for the right purpose. So you've got to know when to use mnemonic devices and which ones to use. And secondly, you need to practice the recall trigger so that it's strong enough to help you remember the information when you need it. For the rest of this chapter, I'm going to teach you how to use spaced repetition, the right way to use repetition, and then we're going to briefly cover some uses of mnemonic devices to aid memory. Now let's turn to the right methods to use to remember what we learn. And the first right method is called spaced repetition or spaced practice. Repetition is the key to recall. Anything that you want to recall, you need to have repeated exposures to so that you can build a strong neural network. However, the best way to practice, the best way to use repetition is by spacing your practice and review over a period of time, allowing those intervals to increase as your reviews go on. We're going to start with some of the theory behind spaced repetition, and then I'm going to show you some ways that you can apply it. This handsome gentleman is Hermann Ebbinghaus, a 19th century German psychologist who was intrigued by memory and made one of the great and early discoveries about how to optimize our memory. He discovered spaced repetition. Ebbinghaus was running an experiment. He was trying to see if he could remember a long string of random syllables by committing them to memory. And so he would practice them by repeating them until within a study session he could say them perfectly. But he discovered that his retention of that information underwent a sharp non-linear decline. In other words, there was this rapid drop-off of how much he could remember from his hard work after a few days. And he called that exponential loss. Exponential loss. And then he made one of the great discoveries in the study of memory. He stumbled on it actually. He realized that if instead of doing a very intensive study on one day and one occasion, if he spread out his study time over many days, so shorter times but repeated more frequently, his memory improved dramatically until eventually he could almost not forget what he was trying to commit to memory. He referred to this as the forgetting curve. Let's have a look at it. Here is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. So if he studied something over here, one very intensive study session until he could repeat, I think it was 120 random syllables in order. By the end of that study session, he could remember them perfectly, but after just one day, he had forgotten more than half of them, and after 6 days, his retention was almost at zero. However, if instead of one intensive study session here, he had a number of smaller study sessions but spread them out day after day, the repeated exposures meant that his retention got better and better and better. And so this is the forgetting curve. You need to study material more than once in order to build strong neural networks so that you can remember it. I know this is a lot of information, but there's 4 more principles that relate to spaced repetition that I want to introduce you to before we turn to some of the how to apply it aspects. The first one is the spacing effect. The idea here is that our brain retains information after repeated exposure. Imagine how a child learns a new word. They get exposed to it and then it comes up again after a few minutes or hours, again tomorrow. And these repeated exposures, not all at once, they're spaced out, they're spread. It's the natural way that we learn stuff, by repeated spaced exposure. We call it the spacing effect. A cousin to the spacing effect is what is known as the lag effect. The lag effect says that the optimal spacing between your exposure to things can get increasingly wider as your mastery grows. So if we go back to our example of trying to learn a new word, if you were trying to learn the word logos in Greek, for instance, initially you would need to review it quite frequently, but as you became more familiar with it, the time gaps could grow wider and wider without compromising your ability to remember the word. That is the lag effect. And together, the spacing and the lag effects make up what we know as spaced repetition. It basically says that our memory of stuff is optimized when we review material repeatedly, the repetition part, over increasing time gaps, or with increasing time gaps between the reviews. That's the spaced and lagged effect. There are 2 more things that go into this melting pot. The first one is known as desirable difficulty. Desirable difficulty might sound like a scary concept, but the idea is quite simple. Learning is best if you review material right before you're about to forget it. Isn't that weird? Your next review of material is optimal if the review comes at the point where you can remember it, but you have to strain to remember it. That difficulty in remembering is desirable. It improves retention. And what it means is that we can optimally space out the timing of our review and practice of material using desirable difficulty to calculate the lag effect. The fourth element of this is the thing called interleaving. It's a big word, but essentially it just means that you should mix up your practice. Mix up your practice. What exactly does that mean? Let's imagine that you're doing maths. Instead of doing 50 of the same kind of problem in a row, you should do one of that kind of problem and then a different problem, and then another of that kind of problem, and then maybe two other types, so that you're constantly mixing it up. Or if you were trying to study both English and biology, you should not try to do all your English and then when you finished with English, do all your biology. Rather, you should chop and change, mix up your practice. Initially, when you mix up practice, you'll find that it feels like you're learning less, that it's harder to retain and remember what you're learning. But the research shows that long-term recall benefits immensely from this interleaving, this mixing up of what we are studying. And the reason is quite simple when you think about it. Every time you switch what you're doing, you close a neural network and you open another neural network. And then when you come back to the first thing, you reopen that neural network. So like the person in the gym doing lots of repetitions, this mixing of our practice means that our brains are constantly activating, closing, and reactivating key neural pathways, and that greatly improves retention. That, in a nutshell, is the science of memory. The science of remembering is built on spaced practice or spaced repetition, combined with its cousins, desirable difficulty, and interleaving, mixing our practice. And if you apply these regularly to your study, you'll find that your retention of what you are studying will improve remarkably. Right, so it's all good and well knowing the theory of spaced repetition, but how do we use this to ensure that we remember what we are learning more effectively? Spaced repetition basically enables you to remember your study notes by reviewing them repeatedly at ever-widening intervals. Now, you can do this manually if you wish. If you want to do it manually, I would suggest that you review after 1 day, then after 1 week, then after 1 month, then after 6 months, and then after 1 year. That would give you 5 reviews at ever-widening intervals. You will be amazed how that will improve your retention of the information that you have been studying. However, we live in the age of technology, and technology can come to our aid by giving us much better ways of managing this spaced practice and review than doing it manually. Let's have a look at some of those. The key tool for spaced repetition is the flashcard. I'm sure you know what they are. In case you don't, a flashcard is a little piece of cardboard where you write a topic on one side and comments about it on the other, or you write a question on the front and the answer on the back. And the idea is that you can review this information by using the flashcard as a prompt. And flashcards work brilliantly, but there's a problem. Flashcards don't work unless you have a way of reviewing them regularly at sensible intervals. So they work, they're a great tool, but you need to have a way of using them with spaced repetition. Enter the so-called Lightner box. The Lightner box. This is how you could do flashcards and spaced repetition manually. It arose in the era before the technology that we have at the moment. It's absolutely ingenious and extremely simple. So you make a flashcard. There's our card. And you start in box 1. And then you have intervals between the different boxes. This might be 1 day, and then 1 week, and then 1 month, and so on, right? So you have different intervals between the boxes, and you make a flashcard and you put it in box 1, and then you review it. If you get it right, you move it forward to box 2, which you're going to review 1 day later. If you get it right again, you move it forward to box 3, which you're going to review, let's say, 1 week later, and so on. However, if you get it wrong, you have to move it backwards so that your review of it becomes more frequent. The idea is that the cards that you know really well, you move further and further to the right so that you review them less frequently, while the ones that you know less well get moved further to the left where your reviews are more regular. It's an ingenious idea, works brilliantly. There's a problem though. It's quite onerous to do, to make manual flashcards and physical boxes and then move them forward and backward and keep track of which days you're going to review which cards on. That gets quite tedious. And of course, in the age of tech, there are technologies that will do this for us, taking most of the pain out of it. What we need are flashcard apps that are programmed with spaced repetition algorithms. The apps are amazing. They make it really easy to create flashcards. You can do it on your computer, your phone, your tablet. You can build into your flashcards audio and video and pictures, so you can make them really nice and flashy. And then the flashcard program has an algorithm built into it that applies spaced repetition. It tracks your mastery of each card to see how well you know them, and then it works out when you next need to review that card. So basically what you do is you make a card, and the first time you review it, and then you turn over to see the answer, and it'll give you maybe 3 or 4 options, ranging from I forgot this to I knew it immediately and easily, and perhaps a couple of options in between, and you tell the program how well you remembered that card. It then knows when you need to see it again. If you keep remembering it well, those gaps get wider and wider, the lag effect. And the moment you get it wrong, it moves it forward, and those gaps become small once again. And so the app helps you to apply spaced repetition and keeps track of when you need to see each card next. What are the best ones? Well, the 2 gold standards currently are mnemonic and Anki. They're both phenomenal. They're the clear champions in the spaced repetition world at the time that I'm preparing this video. They may not be by the time you're watching it, but right now they are. They're both programmed with spaced repetition. Anki is completely free and was the long-standing champion in this space. Remnote's the new kid on the block. It's got a free version that's not 100% featured. The fully featured one has a few more, comes at a small fee per month. And Remnote is probably more difficult to use immediately, but once you've mastered it, it is quicker and easier to use. So 2 amazing options. I would strongly recommend that you consider investigating and using at least one of them, and we'll give you some tutorials on how to use them outside of this lecture. So the first right method to remember what you've learned is spaced repetition. The second right method is to use mnemonic devices. Now, mnemonic devices are tools or little tricks that you can use to help you recall information. You recall information by accessing it from your long-term memory. When you've mastered information thoroughly, you can access it easily from long-term memory. For instance, I don't need any kind of tricks or gadgets to help me remember my physical address, my phone number, my wife's name, and so on. But if you were to tell me your address, phone number, and your wife's name, I wouldn't be able to remember that well because I'm not going to use it all the time. And that's where I could use a mnemonic device to help me remember it if I needed to remember it for some particular purpose. So we use mnemonic devices to help us to remember stuff that we haven't yet fully mastered. Once we've mastered it, we don't need the mnemonic devices anymore. They are incredibly effective. They work really well, but you need to learn how to use them sensibly. Let's take a look. Let's consider some foundational principles about mnemonic devices. Do they work? Absolutely. They work amazingly well if you use them wisely. Before we turn to some of the practical side of it, let's consider 3 foundational principles. The first thing is that mnemonic devices create artificial connections between the familiar and the unfamiliar, between what you know and what you are trying to learn. The connections that they build are artificial. What do we mean by that? I sometimes have to write academic abstracts, and there are 6 things that you shouldn't put in abstracts: abbreviations, symbols, acronyms, footnotes, citations, and quotations. I use the acrostic, always stay away from crying queens, to help me remember that. Each letter in the sentence, always stay away from crying queens, represents one of the things that I need to avoid. The first letter is the memory clue. Always stands for abbreviations, stay stands for symbols, and so on. Now, why is the link artificial? Because there's no logical connection between always stay away from crying queens and abbreviations, symbols, acronyms, citations, and so forth. So the link is artificial. That's how they work. They create an artificial link that helps you to retrieve stuff that you are still in the process of mastering. The second key principle, therefore, is that they help you to learn what you've not yet mastered. When you have a full understanding of something, you don't need artificial triggers. You will have natural triggers. When you've made meaningful connections, you don't need artificial connections and clues. So, wherever possible, it's better not to use mnemonic devices. It's better to spend time making sure you fully understand how things work, the meaning relationships, and so on. Because if your understanding is excellent, you'll be able to remember it. But some things don't lend themselves to easy understanding. For instance, my grade 5 son had to learn the 9 provinces of South Africa with their capitals and a heritage site in each. Now that's difficult to do through pure understanding. So we used mnemonic devices to give him clues that could trigger him into the 9 provinces and their capitals and so on. So it's information that you're still learning or that is difficult to learn by pure understanding that is most conducive for use of mnemonic devices. And then thirdly, there are 2 basic kinds of mnemonic devices: verbal ones and visual ones. Verbal ones rely on letters or words as memory triggers, and visual ones rely on picturing scenes and converting content and facts into mental images that you can visualize. Both of them work. Initially, words are quicker and easier to work with as mnemonic devices. The picture method is more powerful, but it requires more effort to use. Here is an overview of verbal mnemonics. These use words as memory cues. So they use words or letters to cue you in to what you are trying to remember. The 2 most basic ones are alliteration and assonance. Alliteration, stuff that starts with the same letter, and assonance is words that sound similar. So for instance, if you've ever heard of the 4 P's of marketing, the memory aid is that the 4 key things all start with P, and then you use the letter P to try and help you remember what they are. When I was a theology student, we used an outline of Romans that was based on words that sounded the same. So the sections were condemnation, justification, sanctification, and so on. And so the Asian sound helped you to remember the major divisions. These 2 are the easiest to use, but they are also the least effective as memory triggers. The next 2, acronyms and acrostics, work extremely well. Acronym is using the letters of the things you're trying to remember to make a word. Famous one is that the Great Lakes of North America form the word homes: Huron, Ontario, Michigan, etc. And there are some advantages to acronyms because you have a different cue letter for each point. Compared to the 4 Ps, it's more helpful to have a different letter for each point you're trying to remember than to have the same letter 4 times. This also allows you to remember things in order. If you need to remember things in order, alliterating them doesn't help you, but an acronym will tell you exactly the order in which they go. Acrostics are similar. They're like the one I mentioned earlier. Always stay away from crying queens, except that you make a sentence out of the first letters. And then the last three maxims are reducing something to a pithy saying, a proverb that's easily memorable. For instance, the African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Once you learn a proverb, it's hard to forget. Or you can make little rhymes or songs like Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. We're making a rhyme on blue and two to help us remember when Christopher Columbus discovered North America for the Europeans. Or you can make stories with trigger words. So there are lots of ways you can use words as cues to help you remember pieces of information. Visual mnemonics turn words into images, and then they use those images as cues for recall. They are the gold standard of memory. All the world champion memory people, yes, there are official world championships and people who do great memory feats. They all use visual mnemonic methods to achieve remarkable memory feats like memorizing a pack of cards in order in 12 seconds and so on. You don't need to do that. The basic idea is that you turn numbers, words, and concepts into mental pictures, and then you make up a scene, a mental scene that you visualize, and that visualization helps you to recall the concepts, words, or numbers that are encoded in those mental images. Yes, I know it sounds childlike, but oh my word, does it work. And it works because that's how our brains work. Think of any experience you've had where you've actually been in a scene and having a conversation. You can replay sections of that amazingly accurately because your brain remembers experiences, pictures, scenes far better than it remembers words, numbers, and concepts. So essentially, visual mnemonics are techniques that trick our brains into remembering things using the power of pictures and experiences. They work amazingly well, but they do take a fair amount of effort to master. Essentially, that is the key point about visual mnemonics. They work, but they take work. They are powerful, but they're not essential. You can leave them aside, not bother with the effort that's required to become proficient in using them, and by harnessing spaced repetition and simpler mnemonics, word-based mnemonics, you can do a phenomenal job of remembering what you've learned. It's beyond the scope of this lecture to try to uncover and discuss how some of these visual mnemonics work, but we'll try to point you to some good materials that do that in the rest of the course. So in conclusion, memory is an essential part of learning. Unless you can store information and retrieve it at the point of need so that you can use it, you haven't really learned it. We've covered a lot of ground in this lecture, so let's recap some of the key points quickly. We're going to look at 7 summary points. Firstly, we remember through 2 pathways, understanding and repeating, and there's an inverse correlation between them. The better you understand something, the less you need to repeat it in order to retain it. Secondly, repetition is foundational for recall. If you do not review your notes, you will not be able to remember them. Number 3, reviewing should use spaced practice, not massed practice, or spaced repetition, not massed repetition. Number 4, desirable difficulty and interleaving improve practice. So it's desirable to review at the point where it's difficult to remember, but you can, and it's desirable to mix up the practice. Number 5, RemNote and Anki are the best tools currently for applying spaced repetition. Number 6, mnemonic devices, yes, they work, but they are for material that you've not yet mastered. It's better to understand something thoroughly, then you don't need mnemonic devices. But for material that's hard to learn that way, they are incredibly effective. And then lastly, we said that verbal mnemonics are easier to use. Visual ones are more powerful if you are prepared to invest the effort in mastering them. Thank you so much for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end of this lecture, I commend your commitment. It is possible to remember our work. There are some flawed strategies to avoid, but the two key strategies of spaced repetition and astute use of mnemonics can greatly aid your ability to remember what you are studying.